Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. The conversation that we have today is a classic Crawlspace conversation. We have an audio producer and storyteller on the show today. We have had a friendship with this person for a little while now and love the fact that she has taken her talents and created an amazing podcast. But Tim, before we get to that, I want to create an amazing image of your mood. How are you today? Not one of my better ones. I'll give you that.
Thanks a lot. I'm doing well over here. Very excited to introduce our conversation with Emily Reeves. And Emily Reeves produced a 4-part audio documentary series that is called Violence Week, and you can get that on your favorite podcatcher. It's called Violence Week. Very interesting story about an outburst of violence at her high school, actually, in East Lansing, Michigan, and it led to the discovery of a gun and a lot of racial questions, and the role of police officers in schools is worthy of a deep dive in this series as well, which I found very interesting.
You're right. It is very interesting, and the way Emily tells this story is in such a manner that you can almost feel the tension that's building up. And the discovery of this gun is the inciting moment that causes this pot to boil over. It's really representative of a lot of things that are happening over the past 10, 15 years, 20 years. And Emily turns the conversation around at one moment when she asks us if we had any police presence at our school consistently when we were in high school. And you did, because there were some incidents that had happened that had caused them to be there on a consistent basis. No school shootings, though. But I didn't. When she asked that question, I was like trying to imagine what that would have been like as a student. And it just would have been the most like insane thing to think that the police officers that I knew in our small town had to be at the high school full time. And now that's just a thing that happens. Like, kids are used to seeing a police officer there. Emily opens up that conversation with her storytelling about her high school and how that's changed. And they were always so proud of being inclusive and progressive. And when they find this gun, all of a sudden, all these emotions start coming out. And that's really the core of her storytelling. It's about the community and how certain elements started to become more present. They needed, as she says a few times, there was this reckoning that started to take place in her town.
Yeah, definitely. It makes for a really interesting story. I'm glad she approached us with it, and I'm glad I got to hear it and experience it. So you can do the same on Spotify or Apple Podcasts if you so choose. But I hope you enjoy this interview with Emily Reeves. And if you want to learn more about Emily, you can go to her website, emilyreevesaudio.com.
We're going to break real quick for a commercial, and we will be right back with Emily Reeves of Violence Week. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Emily Reeves. How are you today?
I'm doing so well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the amazing show that you've produced. And we're super excited to speak with you about this show. But can you let the audience know who you are and what brings you on today?
Yes, my name is Emily Reeves. I am an independent audio producer, and I work on lots of shows across the podcasting space. Everything from reality TV shows to documentaries like Violence Week, which is what we are here to talk about. So Violence Week is a story that I independently produced, published with my colleagues at Silver Sound. It's an audio studio in Manhattan, and Violence Week is all about a controversy at my old high school, which we'll get into. It's been a wild ride creating it.
You just mentioned that you do audio production. Is this something that you've always wanted to do, or is this something that you didn't realize you were really good at until you started to do it?
I was a career transitioner. So I used to be an actor. At first, actually, when I was entering the industry, I thought that was going to be kind of unique, and I was a little embarrassed to tell people like, I used to be an actor, because, people have lots of preconceived ideas about actors, some of which are we deserve. I have since learned that there is like quite an actor to podcast producer pipeline. There's a lot of us out here. And I do think there are similar skills that come from it. I mean, in a way, they're similar art forms in that every piece of information you're giving to the audience, it has to be achieved in that moment. You can't rewind, you can't pause. I mean, of course, in podcasts, you could rewind, but if a podcast listener is rewinding constantly, they're eventually going to get frustrated and give up. So I think the storytelling skills align. Really, when I was an actor, I was just podcast obsessed. I was doing these crazy auditioning days in New York where I would get up at 4:30 a.m. and I'd be on the streets of Manhattan running from audition to audition, standing in line, going and working some crazy job in the evening. And podcasts were really what got me through it. And so the pandemic hit. I was bored creatively and decided to start a podcast. And it just spiraled from there. I realized how much I loved it. I also loved that it was storytelling, but it also had this really juicy, unique ability to tell stories and talk about real things, real issues. Always been really passionate about the news. And so I love how audio can kind of humanize the news, humanize the issues that we're facing as a society, and get really deep into the details.
That's like one of the best answers that we've ever gotten when we've asked somebody why they decided to get into what they've gotten into.
Oh my God, I love it. Okay, cool.
Okay, so what about this story? Why did you feel like this story was the one for a podcast that you're going to be producing and narrating very well, might I add?
Thank you. Yes. So, like I said, this story is about a controversy that happened in my high school. So it originally came to me like all hometown gossip does, which is that my mom started texting me about, hey, there's this crazy controversy going on at the high school. Like, not even thinking about me being an audio producer. That was how I approached it too. Like, I just was so intrigued by the topic. I watched a couple clips of this fated school board meeting that happened. We can get into all the details, and was just shocked. It was nothing like I had ever seen my hometown be before. I saw my old teachers. I graduated in high school in 2011, so there are still a few teachers who are kicking it around. I saw them at this meeting crying. I saw students getting up and telling this like harrowing testimony about what it's like to be a student in the era of school shootings, what it's like to constantly see over and over again that there's this threat and it could happen to you at any time, and there's nothing the adults are really doing about it. And so it struck me in so many ways, just on a personal level. And then I started to do a bit of research, and I realized that there were a lot of tensions in the story that were playing out nationally. I saw all these other reportings from local newspapers from around the country about what their towns were trying to do to stop school shootings, and their debates about school policing, which we'll also get into about this story. Yeah, it tied back to that thing about like why I love audio. I love that audio has the ability to like sit in these really complicated questions and hear the human side of it. And so I knew it was the type of story that I love.
Okay, so you mentioned the school board, you mentioned the town. This is in East Lansing. Can you just open that up a little bit for us? What's East Lansing like? And what was it like for you going back there?
Yeah, it's funny. I said to a lot of people throughout the year that I was creating this that it was kind of like a DIY high school reunion. My 10-year high school reunion should have been in 2021. I don't know if I would have gone, but it should have been in 2021. But it got canceled because of the pandemic. And so I really hadn't thought that much about my high school until the story came back into my life. And it originally, I was pitching it to radio shows to be like a 15, 20-minute story. And just the deeper I got into it, the more layers it unfolded about questions about how I thought about my hometown, the stories we tell ourselves in the town about who we are. So yeah, it's been like a DIY high school reunion. But East Lansing, Michigan, it is a quintessential college town. It's where Michigan State University is. So the town really revolves around that. And, because it's a big college town, very much like my childhood memories are filled with drunk students. Like they're just kids, lying in gutters, having drunk too much. Like it was very much, it colors the whole town. Even one detail I put in the podcast is that my high school was right next door to a sorority. Like the town and the university just really are on top of each other. Besides that, East Lansing is also right next door to the state capital, Lansing. So that's also how some people may know of it. But specifically, the story takes place in my old high school, right? So let's talk a little bit about the high school. It's very notable in the community for being like a really well-respected academic school. It had a lot of like grade AP classes and well-funded after-school sports. And it also is well known for being considered to be very diverse. So it was a thing that we talked about a lot when I was growing up, that We were really proud to be diverse. It was always a stated goal of ours to be improving racial equity, and it was something we talked about a lot. I went to high school in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and it was just very much a different world back then. I don't think we quite thought about it as critically as we did today. So it was interesting going back and seeing how this value in my community around diversity has kind of moved with the times, and how our cultural reckoning, our entire country's reckoning about race in 2020 played out in this town, even when, it was so important to them. It's such an important value to them. I think a lot of the stories we hear about our culture wars are kind of on the other side. We hear a lot about book bannings and things like that in conservative schools. And this was really a reckoning on the liberal side. So it opened up a lot of questions I had throughout the years about how we told that story about race and diversity in my hometown.
Okay, so tell us about the issues at the school system in East Lansing.
So this story really all starts after COVID. One thing I found that was really interesting, I had a pretty great high school experience. It wasn't like the best, they weren't the best years of my life, but I still enjoyed my high school time. I was really struck when I was talking to the students that I talked to about what their high school years were like. When I interviewed these students, they were going into their senior year, and this was a group of students who they were in 8th grade when 2020 happened. So their whole high school experience was really, really affected by the pandemic. The first couple of years of high school, they were going in and out of lockdowns. They were adjusting to constantly shifting safety protocols. So I really felt for them just with how much change had been going on throughout their entire schooling experience. But the story really is centered in late 2022. Students are coming back. Everybody is really noticing this increase in violence. We all went to high school. I'm sure we all have crazy stories about fights at our high school. In middle school, I was in a science lab and we were dissecting frogs and a girl stabbed a guy with the scalpel. Like, we always had these crazy stories about fights at my school. And I think that's pretty normal for high school. So I was struck that even among that context, the people at this school were really noticing an increase, and there was this atmosphere of fear. And this is actually something that was playing out around the country at the time. It was very anecdotal, but lots of teachers, lots of administrators were noting that students were coming back from lockdowns and they were struggling with more misbehavior. They were struggling with an increase in violence. It's that national story on top of this story. But it became clear that these fights were really happening between two groups of boys. I won't get into exactly why they were fighting. I kind of stray away from that from the podcast because really I want to get into the bigger question that it evokes. But these two groups of boys are fighting, and the fights just keep getting worse and worse and worse and more violent. And parents are coming to school board meetings telling these stories about how their kids are coming home from school, like rushing for the bathroom because they didn't want to go to the bathroom the whole day because that's where the fights often broke out. Teachers are getting hit as they try and break up the fights. It's just getting worse and worse, but still it's simmering under the surface until January 19th, 2023. This is the inciting incident for the whole podcast. There are these two groups of boys. It is after an evening basketball, and a huge fight breaks out in the school's parking lot. And a teacher is breaking up the fight, and a gun falls out of a backpack. And this just sends the town into a full-blown crisis.
So you did mention that the pandemic happened and the kids who were going back to school were having a tougher time reacclimating to the real world once again, or for the first time, because if you're coming in as an incoming freshman, it's not like you had that high school experience prior to this. So the pandemic had an impact. Was there a butterfly effect stemming from the George Floyd murder?
Yeah, absolutely. And so after this gun is found, it really provokes this huge crisis in the community. And there's two things that had happened in that time period that you're mentioning that are now factors in what happens. So that gun was found on a Thursday night. The next morning, Friday morning, those students are back at school. The teachers hadn't been told, the broader community hadn't been told what happened, and rumors are spreading. One student even told me, she went to school and she was hearing that somebody got shot the night before. And so the administrators pull these students out of class. Another huge fight breaks out. And this really sends the whole community into this frenzy. They're very upset that these students were allowed back at school. They're very upset that this violence was even allowed to keep happening. And on Monday evening, there was this insane school board meeting, which we spend a lot of time with in the podcast. And this was the school board meeting that I watched that made me realize that this was a story that was worth telling. Because in this, we've talked a lot about the story of race in my community. People are getting up to say that, yes, they love that East Lansing really values diversity, that they went to this school, they brought their kids to the school because of the diversity. But it's become clear that to a lot of the community, it seems like the school is over prioritizing decisions for equity, for racial equity above all else, and that it's created this atmosphere in the school where kids know that they're not going to get in trouble for anything. We could get into a lot of the data surrounding racial disparities in schools, but it is very clear that in many, many, many communities around the country, Black and brown students face more punitive measures. They often get in trouble for situations where perhaps white students wouldn't, or would have a different option of maybe talking to a counselor about it or something. And so East Lansing's really made this a goal to fix this. But in the community, after this gun happens, people feel like there is this atmosphere, this lax atmosphere that has basically led to this series of events that has all accumulated with this gun. So that's the one element. The one element of this is discipline. But that is tied to what happened in the community in 2020, 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd. There was another school board meeting where the administrators got online. Of course, it was an online school board meeting at that time, and read out this list of commitments for racial equity. And one of those is really the centerpiece of the story, which is that they decided to remove police officers from the school. I'm curious, did you two have police officers in your school? What's your experience with this?
It's always weird to me to hear that, because I went to school in the 40s and 50s. I'm just kidding. It wasn't the 40s and 50s. But no, when I went to school, I actually graduated high school. When was Columbine? 96?
99.
Columbine was 99.
99. Yeah. So Columbine hadn't even happened yet. So there was no purpose. There was no reasoning. It would have been absolutely insane if we saw a police officer in school. It would be like the talk of the school.
Yeah. I always ask because we had a police officer when I was in school. I went to school after Columbine, and it was just the norm. We didn't really think much about it. And it's been interesting to me telling this story because so many people have said exactly what you said to me, which was like, what? I can't believe you had a cop at school. And we just took it for granted.
We had one at mine. I want to say we had several, actually. There had been a riot at my high school a few years before I got there. So I think that was why. But yeah, I was there. I was like probably a month left of school when Columbine happened. So It didn't have anything to do with Columbine.
Yeah. Well, and yes, there's a lot we could talk about here, but the vast majority of schools that do have cops originally got their funding for their police officer after Columbine. That was the case for East Lansing. I didn't know it. But still, when I went to school, we knew about Columbine, but we weren't talking about school shootings that often. We had lockdown drills, and we would kind of goof around during them. I remember once my math class piling up all these chairs and desks, and we made a joke target, and we said shoot here on this piece of paper and put it up. Like we just didn't take it as a serious threat. And so that was also really interesting talking to the students in the story. I was a student journalist in my high school, so I went and talked to the student journalists at the school now. And they told me these really harrowing stories about what it was like to, live with that fear, what it's like to be in lockdowns nowadays. So it's just such a different atmosphere. But yes, back to the cops issue. So the school removes police. It's in the pandemic, so it's not like that change is immediately felt in the hallways. It's really in these fights elevating and in this gun being found that people are like, wait, what's going on? Where are the cops? And ultimately, this highlights the central tension of the story, which is some people want cops to be there to protect against the threat of school shootings. Other people, knowing all this data about how cops are bad for racial justice in school on the whole, of course, think that bringing them back is going to put students of color at risk. So again, it's these two really important values for the community. It is, we really want to do the right thing for students of color. We really want to protect them. And also, we reasonably have no idea what to do about school shootings. We have no ideas, so a lot of people want a cop back to feel safer.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Tell us, do officers in schools, do they help prevent school shootings?
Yes. So this is a hot topic. Lots of debate about this. Ultimately, what happens with school policing, if you look at the history of school policing, is that cops are put in schools for two reasons. The very first cops were actually put in schools in my home state in Flint, Michigan in 1953, and that's in a moment where the state is going through some major demographic changes. They were put in because of issues of overcrowding and delinquency, things that have some pretty intense racial undertones to it. Maybe not even undertones, overtones perhaps. And so the story of police in schools really is connected to the story of race in our country until Columbine, that event we've gone back to again and again. That's when a lot of schools decide to get a police officer. And again, you can understand that impulse. None of us want school shootings. It is absolutely horrible. Every single time we get that news alert on our phone, every single time we have to watch the clips and hear from these students, and people don't know what to do. So yes, there's a couple things there. While they are being brought in for many reasons to prevent against school shootings, again, we have this issue of over-policing in schools. So when cops are in schools, the chances that they're going to get involved when something goes wrong, of course, goes up. So there are a lot of incidences where the cops have a hard time separating what is a crime. And just to be clear for people who don't know, cops in schools are called school resource officers. And usually they are a full police officer and they come into the school in a partnership between the school and the local police precinct. So they're really there to be police officers, right? They are there to intervene if there is a crime. But of course, there are these incidences where a student is misbehaving. It's not a crime, but the police officer gets involved. And so because of that criticism, school resource officers have really advocated for themselves that they're there to do three things. They're there to prevent crime. They are there to be counselors to struggling students. And in that way, they say that they are preventing school shootings. And they're also doing education, DARE courses, coming into classroom to speak about other crimes. So in that way, they are pitching themselves as prevention for crime. What I think is ultimately really interesting about this, and there's a great Atlantic article if anyone's really interested in, called Stop a Shooter, which is about the SRO at Parkland in Florida and how he faced criminal responsibility for not getting involved. Ultimately, we're asking these police officers to do a lot. We're asking them to be a counselor for a struggling student, and we're also asking them to single-handedly, with a pistol, take on a potential school shooter who has a rifle. I think wherever you fall on the defund the police to the thin blue line spectrum, we can all agree on this, that is unreasonable to be asking one person to be able to fill all those roles. Can a cop with 1 week of additional training to be an SRO, which not even every SRO has, be prepared to be a counselor for struggling kids? I don't know. And is it reasonable to ask a cop to single-handedly go into these situations and try and take down a shooter? It actually goes against a lot of training that police do. Now, a lot of agencies train their police to wait until they can have a team of 4 to 6 to come in. There's a lot of details about why that is, that Atlantic article really gets into, that I really enjoy. But yes, there are a few incidences of cops stopping school shootings, but on the whole, we've seen again and again countless examples of times that the police weren't able to have a great response to an incident. And so it's just a bit more complicated than I think we want. I think we want to focus on the question of, should there be cops in schools? Should our school have a cop? No matter what, whether or not this cop might be able to stop a school shooting, they can't guarantee it, right? So it needs to be a lot more nuanced, I think, of a conversation.
What are the qualifications that a police officer would have in order to become the school resource officer?
Yeah, this is a bit also part of the issue here, which is that there's no national standard for it. So there's an organization called the National Association of School Resource Officers, NASRO. They are kind of the main voice for SROs, and they have all these trainings that they provide, but not every school does that. There's not national or even state standards about it. More and more, as this kind of counselor aspect of school policing has come into the foreground, police precincts are picking the cop who is going to be super friendly, who's going to be able to talk to students, who's going to be able to be personable. That cop also probably isn't the same cop who is going to, when something bad happens, spring into action and become this insane Navy SEAL guy who's going to go take down the school shooter. So those are probably two different people.
Okay, now can you tell us about what happened when Marcus got tased?
Yes. So this was a surprising aspect of my reporting too. Like I said, I had originally pitched this idea to be like a 15, 20-minute radio story to a national radio show. And I was just going to be exploring this like central question around school policing. But throughout my reporting, I kept having more and more reminders of what happened when I was in high school, this incident that really for the first time made me critically think about cops in my schools. Like I said, it had always been the norm. We didn't really consider that there could be another option until this happened. So this happened my senior year of high school, November 2010, and Marcus was in the year below me. We weren't friends. He was on the football team. I was on the yearbook. We were in different grades. So we didn't really know each other. But what ended up happening is that the school resource officer for my school got into a confrontation with Marcus in front of our busy lunchroom. So there were hundreds of students around. And ultimately, Marcus was tased in the chest by the police officer 2 times. It was a really big deal. We talked about it a lot, but I don't think we made as big of a deal as we should have about it. And so as I'm watching these school board meetings that are going on in 2023, I'm seeing more and more mentions of what had happened to Marcus. You know, at the very end of that first school board meeting where parents are screaming and the superintendent is crying, somebody on the school board brings up, you know, I joined the school board after this boy was tased in 2010 unfairly. And that was a big motivator for us getting rid of cops. Who knows how direct of a tie that was, but it clearly lived on in the mind of my community. So I ended up reaching out to Marcus. He was down to talk once he heard about the gun being found at school and understood why I was talking about this. I met up with him and his mom, Deandra, which was a miracle because I wasn't supposed to meet with Deandra at first. And she ended up hearing that Marcus and I were going to speak. And she was like, I have to be there. You have to include me. And she was really passionate and had so much to say about it. I went into that conversation. You know, I had heard multiple narratives about this tasing for years. I had heard a lot of students who saw it happen say that Marcus wasn't doing anything wrong and that the cop was really out of line to tase him. I had heard from teachers and some adults in the community that Marcus was, you know, quote unquote, out of control and that he really needed to be tased to get to calm down. I knew that there were these 2 narratives about it, and I knew that I was going to be hearing Marcus's side of the story. I was very aware of that as a reporter coming in. I spent 4 hours at his house, and I left that evening just shocked. It was so much more black and white than I thought. We also were able to watch footage of the tasing happen, and I was stunned. I mean, it was insane to me that there was even any narrative in the community about him that it was fair for him to get tased. And ultimately, it comes down to, you know, he was in a group of people. It was a tense situation. His girlfriend was being suspended. And he was trying to intervene in what, you know, when I watched the footage, he continues to have this really calm presence throughout the whole thing. He is not hitting anybody, but the school resource officer got on his mic and said that he had been assaulted by a black man. A group of police officers rush in, and within seconds, they are tasing him in the chest and he's on the ground. And so, yeah, it was, for me as a reporter, it was one of the moments where, oh my gosh, this story is bigger than I thought. It needs to be told. And it was part of the reason that it became a full series. And it's Marcus's story is a lot of people's favorite part of the podcast series. I think it really hits home about the stakes, right? We've heard a lot about the stakes of school shootings. We all know those stakes. But it's really a great window into what the stakes are for having police in schools. Even though Marcus turned out okay, he didn't end up going to jail for it because of this videotape that proved that he hadn't assaulted the officer. But it could have gone differently. For a lot of students that this happens to in schools, they do end up in the criminal justice system. We call it the pipeline to prison, the school to prison pipeline. It is a phenomenon that happens in schools, that something happens at school, the police get involved, and then now this student has had their first touch point with the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of data to show that has lifelong effects. So
yeah, you said that it's some of the listeners' favorite part of the show itself. And it definitely was my favorite part. I really liked how you interacted with Marcus and his mom, and the rapport was instantly there. She was so into describing it as best she could and communicating that to ears beyond the room. You could tell that she knew that this was going to be something that a lot of people are going to listen to, and she can finally set the record straight. She was so passionate about the tape and how he wasn't doing anything. You were explaining it as well. But I do want to bring up another point about the tasing to the chest. I didn't realize that was something that you aren't supposed to do. that tasing somebody directly in the chest could kill them.
Right. And it can cause, especially if people already have heart problems, which of course the police officers aren't going to know whether or not that's the case. It can affect people's natural heart rhythm and cause some consequences. So, I asked them what they made of that. Why would he tase him in the chest if that is not supposed to be the case? And Marcus said he felt like the cop went directly for the chest. It was immediate. It's not like he tased him in the leg first and couldn't get Marcus down and then escalated it. It felt pretty intentional to Marcus. And that's pretty devastating. Even if that wasn't that police officer's intention, it's sad that a 17-year-old student is dealing with this in his school.
I'm going to try my best to articulate this question. Marcus really wasn't doing anything to escalate or even instigate that moment. His brother, though, started to become more aggressive and was being a bit more, and you even say, like, they admitted, yeah, he was being more combative. What exactly, in your opinion, is the line between when someone of that age, a student, is having one of these moments with an authoritative figure, whether it's a school faculty member or a police officer? When does it become too much for the student to defend themselves to a level that is going to escalate to a tasing?
Right, of course. And I think this is another thing, too. It's great to look at the story of Marcus and really feel the impact of it and be like, we should remove police from schools. Like, this is ridiculous. But again, you talk to any teacher, they have some crazy stories about having to intervene in fights, in conflict. And I don't think it's fair to ask teachers to do that. I am not an educator. I don't have a great answer for what that line is, especially because, right, 17-year-olds, they're almost adults. They can be very large. They can be intimidating. The reason I brought that up about Marcus's brother and Marcus was that Marcus's brother was smaller and he's on the side shouting throughout what happens. And like I said, Marcus has his hands in the air. He's saying, what did I do? What did I do? What did I do? While all these police officers are tugging on his arms. Yet he's the one who gets tased, not his brother who's shouting. So I think it just highlights again, really the story is all about fear. It is about what happens when a community is afraid of something and tries to make a decision. It is about what happens to a country, as we see again and again, things that should make us very scared. How do we deal with that? And I think, that police officer probably felt scared. He probably felt like, I'm in a conflict with the 6'4" guy. Who knows, maybe the fact that Marcus was Black did impact how he was feeling. And so, it just shows again, what happens when we're afraid and how that can just quickly spiral things out of control. So that was a lot of differing thoughts about it. But I think ultimately it's, if we are going to have cops in schools and if we do want to make sure that teachers don't have to be the one to intervene in those moments, my takeaway from all of this was really that schools, again, shouldn't just be asking, should we have a cop or not? We should be asking a lot of really specific questions about when are they getting involved? And apparently East Lansing had done this. Apparently the cop was really only supposed to get involved when something criminal had happened, but asking really critically, when are they getting involved? What weapons do they have on them? When are they going to deploy those? And what are our processes for each step of that process so that we avoid as much as possible? And again, it's not black and white. You'll hear in the podcast at one point, Marcus say that with school shootings, with the threat of guns, he thinks there should be an officer in the school. It should just be the right police officer, which is a whole nother can of worms that we could open up. Can you guarantee you find the right police officer? Yeah, asking a lot more specific questions, I think, is where I land there.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
In your opinion, you think most schools should have them, or it really just depends on the answers to those questions?
Ooh, what a question. Yeah, I know that our opinions about police officers are really divided along partisan and racial lines in this country. So it was really important for me to honor both sides, not to go in and just have an opinion. Clearly, you're hearing that I'm from a liberal town. I also live in Brooklyn. It's pretty easy to understand probably where on that spectrum I lie, but I wanted to honor both sides. It is very, very reasonable for people to feel conflicted about violence at school, to feel really scared about school shootings, and to not know what to do. I think it's just really important that communities know, exactly like we were talking about. There are a few examples of school resource officers stopping shootings, but on the whole, it usually doesn't happen. And usually they're waiting for a police response to come anyways, so that they can create the correct response to any sort of school shooting situation. You know, I talked to a school safety expert in one of the episodes, and he really lands on like, okay, look at the school. Like, how far away are you from the police station? Like, East Lansing is 2 or 3 blocks away from the police station. Like, they can get there in a second. And you can see that in what happened to Marcus, right? Like, the cop radios, and a few seconds later, a huge group of cops are running in and tackling him. So there's a lot of questions. Yeah. What is our goal for having this police officer? What are they there to do, really specifically? And if it is there to prevent school shootings, just hiring a cop is not going to be enough, because like we said, it's not a guarantee. And there are a lot of other considerations. You know, how well is everyone being trained? How well is this cop being trained? Is this cop even doing that much training about school shootings? Like the Parkland story that I mentioned, he had done like one training. I'm not going to get the exact number of hours right. He had done like one training a couple years before. I think they did 90 minutes of actual practice for a situation. That's not going to prepare somebody for that moment. So if you're bringing them in for that, then you should be really critical and coming to your school board meetings before there's a crisis, asking, what are we doing to get them the training that we need? What are we doing to make sure that everyone's really on board during the drills, and understanding exactly what to do if this happens, and not drawing fake targets and goofing around like I was in high school when we were doing these drills. So
why don't we do anything about it? Like, what's your opinion on that? Why don't we do anything about it when it happens? It happens so many times. And we say the same thing every single time, and then it happens again, and we say the same thing every single time.
Yeah, I talked to a school administrator for East Lansing who's also an education policy expert at Michigan State. She said the same thing. She's like, you know, people want security from me, that I can make the school safe. And it was really heartbreaking to hear this, because she was like, of course, that feels like it's my job, but I actually can't guarantee that. There's nothing I can do to guarantee that. So she was like, come on, lawmakers, help me out here. And I also think that lawmakers probably can't guarantee that nothing's going to happen, but I think we can try, to just say, this is a part of American society and we have to deal with that. I don't think that that is honoring these students and these teachers and everybody's experiences. So I think that gun violence is, like so many issues in America, you can't solve it with one thing, right? You can't prevent school shootings from banning guns. You can't prevent school shootings from hiring cops in every school. And so you really have to think about it in a spectrum of ways. And, you know, going back to this very, very early conversation about the climate at East Lansing had really been making a huge effort. Part of that discipline controversy at East Lansing was because they had made a huge effort to start doing restorative justice instead of suspending students, which, you know, I remember being in high school and somebody would get suspended and I'd be like, they get to go sit at home for three days. That's a treat for them probably. What is this doing for anybody? And so I also think a big component of this is, how as communities, how do we support people better so that they don't get into a situation where they want to create violence at school? But it's not any single one of those things. I think often the left and the right, when we're arguing about this, it's we should ban guns. It's about mental health. It's okay, we need a holistic approach to this. And that's where I really landed. If I changed any personal opinion throughout this project, I spoke to these activists in Lansing who work around gun violence. And they just said to me, people keep saying we need to ban guns. We need to ban guns. He's like, well, it's actually that's not going to happen. So it's not helpful to the conversation to just be well, why don't we ban guns? Okay, we can feel that way, but it is going to do a lot more in our country to face the reality that we have the Second Amendment. There are going to be guns. That doesn't mean we couldn't pass laws about specific types of weapons or things like that. Getting real about this issue and attacking it from all sorts of different angles, I think probably is the answer. And that's hard to do because you have to get education policy aligned. You have to get people in the government aligned. And my final thing I'll say is that when I talked to that school safety expert, he brought up that a lot of times schools only talk about this when there is a huge school shooting. So they see a huge school shooting, the parents come into their their meetings and they go, we want you to do something about this. Like, you should do this. You should do this. The school safety expert told me that schools are hiring gun sniffing dogs and buying AI software that is supposed to detect whether or not somebody has a gun on them. I have no idea how that works. I'm very intrigued, but we need to be talking about this not just when we're in these moments of fear and not just when it's on the news and we're screaming at our school boards to fix it, to prevent against it, because it's complicated.
I say arm the teachers. Arm them to the teeth. Take these teachers who have no experience with weapons and give them all the ammunition that they need.
All right, hot take, Lance.
Yep.
I would say, again, actually, that kind of connects to the police officer thing, which is like, we're putting somebody in, if we gave every teacher a gun, okay, I'm sure it would not take long for us to see all the different ways that would go south, right?
Wrong.
Right. And so it's kind of that same tension of the police officers. So you want the police officers in the school for the rare chance that there's going to be a school shooting. It's statistically incredibly rare, even as common of an occurrence as it is on a national level. But then what are the day-to-day consequences of having that officer in? This officer who doesn't have much to do, who's bored, who maybe overreacts when something does happen. So yeah, it's like any solution. It might be good in the dream scenario, but what are all the ways that it can go wrong? There's a lot of ways it can go wrong.
So how has the feedback been from the community in reaction to your show? Have you heard a lot of positive feedback, or are you further creating a divide?
I've heard a lot of positive feedback, which has been great. I will say, like, doing a story about a controversy in your hometown is definitely scary. Like, there were people coming up to my parents throughout the years, telling them their side of the story. I was in Michigan for quite a while throughout the year to report it, and people were coming up to me and telling me things that I knew weren't true because I had been actually like combing through the school records and things like that. I was definitely aware that I wanted to do right by the story, and I really wanted to do right by the students who were there, and I really wanted to do right by Marcus. And so I've gotten quite a few emails from grads from my school, people that I went to school with, saying, oh my God, like, I hadn't thought about this in forever, but it reminded me of all these other incidents that happened at the school, all these other aspects of the story that hadn't even been in my memory. But ultimately, like, my favorite feedback that I've gotten is that I've had a few people reach out and say, hearing Marcus's story, like, really changed my opinion about what happened. I did not necessarily make this podcast just for the town of East Lansing, but hearing that as a creator is really positive and makes me feel good.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for spending some time with us here today and telling us about your new show. It's called Violence Week. You can get it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for bearing with me through a complicated and tricky subject.